再次谢谢这次中央大学研发处的这个林宗泰林组长啊，这次促成这次大会的合作哦。那他本身是物理系的教授，我们知道物理系在这次中央大学研究表现非常突出哦。那在接下来呢，我们的这个谈到研究表现哦，跟投稿哦，这是今天大家主要来的，想要找到一些 know how 的主要的原因哦。那接下来我们要请到我们今天的第二位主讲者，就是来自于 Elsevier 的 Arnout Jacobs 先生呢，进一步大家分享啊，我们这一次呢如何来写一个顶级世界级的这个学术论文，如何成功来投稿。我们请我们的 Arnout 先生啊，来我们上台来分享一下他个人的一些在出版上的经验。来，我们欢迎 Arnout 先生。
Good morning. This is the biggest hall that I've ever given this talk in. Thank you for showing up in such great numbers. You've just heard how important it is to publish internationally. So with this talk, I hope to tell you a little bit more about international publishing and how to get your paper into a good journal. But first, a little bit about me. I've been in scientific publishing for more than 10 years now. I've done a little bit of everything. I've published books, I've published journals, I've published electronic databases. And the great thing about scientific publishing is that it's very, very international. So I've lived and I've worked in Belgium, the Netherlands, the United States, France. Then I moved to China, and 3 months ago I moved to Singapore. So it's a place that really you can see the world. Now, in my previous job, I started a big team of about 70 people. And what they did was they helped the scientific editors in reaching decisions. Elsevier receives about 1 million submissions a year. So papers from everywhere in the world. And so the editors, they have lots and lots of work, and we want every paper to get a fair review. So I set up a team of people that could look at papers and then send a summary to the editor so that it's easier for them to make a decision. And in the process of that, we learned a lot about the things that editors like, the things that editors absolutely don't like. And we saw common patterns of the papers that were good. And we saw also a lot of mistakes that kept coming back. And the good news for you is many of those mistakes can be avoided without too much effort. So in this presentation, I will talk about a number of things. Part is how to prepare yourself, because before you can even start writing, you have to do a lot of other things, not the least of which is doing the research. It has to be proper research before you have any chance of writing a good paper. Then I'm going to go into really the nuts and bolts of what makes a paper. What are the elements of a paper and what should you be careful of? I'm also going to mention a couple of technical details. It's easy to forget them, but it's also easy to get rejected because you don't pay attention to them. And finally, I will tell you about the publishing process. You will deal with reviewers, you will deal with editors. They are all people just like you. They're also researchers at universities, and there are ways to deal with them that will increase your chances of getting accepted. And I will have to talk a little bit about ethics. There are international ethical norms for publishing, and if you don't know about them, there's a chance that unknowingly you breach them, and that can have serious consequences. So it's very important to be aware. But first, let's go into the question to publish or not to publish. Why do we publish? Why is there such a thing as scientific publishing? Is anybody have an opinion? Why do you want to publish a paper? Anybody? There are several possible answers, and actually all of them are good. One reason could be I have to publish a paper to graduate. It's a good reason for you. Another reason could be I am already an experienced scientist and I want to apply for more funding. I want people to give me $1 million so that I can buy more equipment for my lab. Also a very good reason for you, but not for the editor. So what does the editor want in a paper? The editors, they simply want good papers. Because good papers get more prestige for the journal, which means that more people will read it, which is also good for the authors. So the editor only cares about these criteria. Scientific journals, for them, the function is that they have to communicate something that is completely new, something that has not been done before and that is original. It can also be to look at what has already been published, and because when scientific discoveries are new, it is interesting to publish it, but people don't really know yet what the big significance is. But that is more clear after a couple of years. So then people write papers to discuss all the findings of other scientists and to make more meaning out of it. That's also possible. Finally, for when a field has really been established for, let's say, 10 years at the least, then it may be time for a review, an overview of a whole field. And you all know review articles, and you've probably read a lot of them because they're an excellent way to learn about a specific subject. And it is not about new research, it is about the key articles in a specific field. And usually the people who write it are very experienced professors that have done research on that subject for a very long time. So, again, here is the reasons of why publishing exists. You have scientists, and they go to a journal, they publish what they have done to the world. This helps them in applications for grants, and the funding bodies, maybe the university itself, maybe a foundation, on the basis of publications, they decide how much money to award. Also, on the basis of publications, international rankings are made. You may know the Shanghai Jiaotong ranking of universities. A lot of people look at that ranking, and for almost 80% of that ranking consists of publications. That's how they rank universities. So, that means that editors, especially in the last few years, they look afterwards, after they have accepted an article, they look at how well that paper is doing. They look at the amount of citations that each paper collects. And on the basis of that, they adjust their acceptance policy. Because, for instance, this editor of our journal, Remote Sensing of the Environment, at one point we told him, we analyzed the journal, and we found out that 1/4 of the papers never got cited. Now, this is a good journal with a decent impact factor, but still, many papers never got cited. And this is quite typical, actually, in many journals. Even in a journal like Nature, quite a few papers get 0 citations. Of course, there are also other papers in the journal that get 180 citations, and that makes for a high impact factor. But actually, in each journal, there are papers that don't do so well. And now, with indexing database, it's much easier to see on an article level which articles do well and which articles don't. So increasingly, the editors are getting strict with what they accept. So here's to summarize it. And you can download my lecture afterwards and study it again when you're writing a paper. But here are some key points. So journals want original research, not duplications of something else. They want something that is significant. It's not enough that it's new, it has to be significant. Of course, you have to have your methods and conclusions, they have to be correct. That's the very basic. Also, readability. Don't underestimate this, because the people who judge your paper, they're very busy people. They're professors, they teach students, they do their own research, they have to do administrative tasks, and then they review papers. So if they have difficulty guessing what you are trying to say, there is a big chance that you get rejected, even though your science might be good. And finally, definitely if you're in pharmaceutical research or you're doing healthcare research with human or animal subjects, you have to get the ethical standards right, and you have to adhere to the international ethical standards, especially of the country that the journal is published in. If you want to publish in, let's say, the New England Journal of Medicine, which is published in America, or in the Lancet, which has a strong British base, make sure that you adhere to their ethical standards. They're not allowed to publish something that may be ethical in your country, but maybe not in the United States. So be aware of that. Another quote from one of our editors-in-chief. Again, maybe you have done something that has never been done before, but this editor says, just because it has not been done before, is no justification, or at least not enough for doing it now. So it's not enough to do something new. You have to think, why is this important? Again, summarizing, these are the questions you should ask yourself before you start writing your manuscript. And preferably even before you start your experiment, because if you find out after your experiment that somebody else has already done it, then you've basically wasted a lot of time. And it's avoidable. You can start it in the beginning by being very well aware of what other people are doing, and on the basis of that, choose your subject. So now we go into the preparations. Of course, first decision is what kind of paper are you going to write? Now, this is actually a summary because papers have lots of names. You can have theoretical papers, methodology papers, clinical studies. But for now, I want to make an easy distinction between three major types of papers. The kind of paper that you see most often, and that most of you will read, are original articles or full articles. They really describe an experiment all the way from the beginning, giving a lot of explanation why it's done, introducing the hypothesis, discussing the complete setup of the experiment. And so these papers are quite long. They can be between 10 and 20 pages in a printed journal. Now, there are also short papers, short communications, letters, it can have different names. These papers are only usually 3 pages long. They have very strict limits in the length, and you don't need to say everything. Maybe you're in the middle of an experiment, and all of a sudden you find something that is very special, that actually you think everybody should know right away, but you don't know exactly what it means yet. Why it is important, and for those, there are some journals accept rapid communications or letters. There are even journals that only publish letters. For instance, one of our journals, Chemical Physics Letters, or Tetrahedron Letters, they're very, very famous journals, and they're especially made for quick communications of important facts. So actually, this can be an easy way to get your limit of the number of papers you have to publish, because sometimes, depending on your university, it counts as a full article, and it's quicker to get published, and it's usually a little bit easier to get in. Finally, I mentioned review papers, and I do get questions, sometimes from PhD students, you know, I really love my field, I would love to write a review. One reason also is that review papers tend to attract a lot of citations, which is again good for the author. However, most review papers get written by invitation only. And the reason is that we really do something because we want to summarize an important field. And usually what we do is we ask someone who was at the origins of the field itself. And we ask them, dear Professor Wang, we know that you've been at the grounding phase of your field, and now we would like you to summarize the field. So it's something for very experienced authors. Now, the second question, after you decided what kind of paper you want to write, you have to immediately start thinking about your audience. And this is not just in scientific writing. This is actually for any kind of message you write, even if it's just an email, or if you're writing for your school paper, or for a general newspaper. You have to think, who is reading this magazine or this journal? And based on that, you can adjust your writing. You know, it's just like a professor when they give a lecture to students. Professors can make two mistakes when they're teaching students. One is they tell things that are too difficult and too much detail for the students. Maybe the students it's just the first year and the professor goes into the latest theories. What happens? People fall asleep and they don't remember anything. But the opposite mistake is also possible. What if the professor is actually speaking for a room full of very smart PhDs, and the professor starts talking about the beginnings of the field and goes very slowly and explains everything? What happens? Everybody falls asleep and doesn't remember anything. So it's finding that balance of saying exactly what you have to say. So today, if I see that you're falling asleep, that means that I'm doing something wrong. Now, what are some of the tricks of knowing what the audience is? Really, you should look at the journal that you like very carefully. And there are some things that you can do. And a very simple trick is simply look at some of the other articles in that journal. How long are they? In how much detail do they go? How much do they explain? How technical are they? That gives you an idea. Of course, if you have a multidisciplinary journal, you might have to explain more. You might have to assume that not everybody knows what kind of machines you work with, what the typical abbreviations are. Or you can work for a very specific niche journal, and then it's okay to be very technical and not to explain too much. Mind you, journals do have their own style. And this is simply because journals have an editor. An editor is a human being that has his or her own preferences. They like certain articles. They like certain styles of writing. And you can learn about that by being more familiar with the journal. The best journals always have a clear identity. So here are the things, summing up, that you have to look at. First thing, look at the aims and scope. It's logical, but it cannot be said enough. You have to read the aims and scope, because the aims and scope indicates very clearly what the journal likes to publish on. And especially journals that are very specific, don't go outside the aims and scope. I know that there are journals that say, we are a journal that invites very specific studies, but also general and multidisciplinary studies on applied, but also theoretical papers. Okay, then you can do everything. Usually these are not the best journals. The best journals are very specific about what they want in terms of types of paper, topics, length, and so on. So pay attention to that. Look at what types they want. Some journals only publish original papers, so don't send them a letter. Other journals have specific types of papers. Some accept some conference papers, some don't. So read that. Readership, as I mentioned. Of course, also the hot topics. And it is really good to be aware of the literature actually as early as you can. As soon as you know where you want to specialize, start reading as much as possible. Maybe not the whole article, maybe just a lot of abstracts, but it gives you a feel of which research is hot right now. It's actually, research is fashion dependent. Some research gets out of fashion, and there can be good reasons for that. Some reasons are not so good, they're more political, but you have to be aware of that. And, again, this is such simple advice, asking your colleagues, asking your professors, they've been there before. If you have people that are a couple of years older than you and they got a couple of papers accepted, just ask them which journals they like to publish in. Each journal deals differently with authors. And some things you can find out from the website, others are more difficult. But if you know somebody that has written papers in a specific journal, ask them, what was their experience like? Did they like the review process? Was it fast enough? Did the reviewers give meaningful comments? All of those things you can find out by asking other authors. Usually they're happy to help. This is, I'm going to go quickly here. This is, once you submit to a journal, you can only submit to one journal at the same time. And the reason is that the people who deal with your paper, many of them do it in their free time. They're professors having a busy job, so they don't like to do work for nothing, because they may have spent a couple of weeks looking at your paper, and then they found out that you're going to publish it with another journal. It makes them very angry. So in the future, they may not want to review your paper again. So that is simply a rule. Only submit your paper one time and wait for a decision. Now, maybe this, if you take away only one piece of advice from this lecture, it is this one. Read the guide for authors and do everything that's in there. Editors often stay with their journals for long times. It's not uncommon for an editor of a famous journal to stay with the journal for 20 years. They love their journal, and they have their own little things that they like and don't like, and they're all in the guide for authors. And it is a thing that you completely control. You can simply read the guide for authors and do everything that's in there. Sure, it may cost you some work to get everything like the journal wants it, and maybe you think it's not very necessary. But still, the editor wants it, you can control it, and so it will increase your chances of getting positive reviews. So it's not something that you want to waste. You know, I myself, some editors say, I want only English spelling. And is that important for the content of the article? No, it isn't. But if the editor wants it, why take a chance and use American spelling? You know, it's a matter of switching your spell checker from US English to UK English. So all of those little things, just do it. If they want double line spacing, give double line spacing. It's also an indication to the journal that you know which journal are you submitting to, that you're not just randomly clicking submit on an online submission site. It shows that you've actually done some effort to get to know the journal, and editors like that. So here again, summarizing, the guide for authors will usually mention things like layout, how long should the length be, how should you deal with the nomenclature. Some journals want you to spell out everything or explain everything. Other journals don't. How do they want the references? A small thing, but again, something you control. Figures and tables. What kinds do they want? Do they want the little lines? Do they not? Do they have a preference for figures or not? And how specific do they want their statistics? Usually those things get specified. Okay, now we go into really the parts that make up a manuscript. Here they are. A typical manuscript will always have these elements. And there are two different parts to articles. This part, title, authors, abstract, and keywords, is very different from this part. Introduction, methods, results, and discussion. So think for a moment, what is different between these two? I'm tempted to appoint somebody, but maybe not. The first part, titles, author, abstract, and keywords, you probably write them the last. You probably write them after you've really described the experiment. So the introduction, the methods, results, and discussion, that is really the contents. That's where you say everything about your research. But before people read this part, they first have to find your article. So that is what this part is about. These are signposts for people to draw interest in your paper. People don't start to read your whole method section or your discussion or your conclusion. What they will read is the title. And if they like the title, maybe they go a little bit further and they read the abstract. And they may find your paper because they've typed in a couple of keywords in Google or in another search engine. So beware that many people, when they see something about your paper for the first time, they're not going to see your whole paper immediately. They will type in a few keywords, and if you have the right keywords, they will find the title in the search engine. If they like the title, they will click on it, they will see the abstract, and only if they like all of that and can find it, will they decide to download your article and really read it and hopefully cite it. So in the past, people just read articles in a journal. Now they read it in a lot of different ways. They read it through the search engine, through the abstracting and indexing database, because other people read about it and it is mentioned. So that's why these things are so important, because if you don't get this right, they will never get to here. There are some other sections as well. They're also a little bit important, but only after people have already found your article. And those are the acknowledgments, where you thank people who have helped you, the references, and increasingly supplementary material, where, for instance, you give a lot of data sets to the journal. So let's go to the title. What is a good title? What is a bad title? A good title describes exactly what the paper is doing. Exactly what you have done in no more words than necessary, but also not less. So make it easy again for the audience to understand you. So it has to have the main findings, but not with a lot of strange words that only the internal people understand. It has to be very specific. Never use words in the title like important or significant or new. Only say exactly what you've done. Be short if you can. Be complete. And most difficult, find a title that is actually sounds nice for an audience. On the one hand, you don't have a lot of options, because it's not like a movie title. It has to be, there's a lot of rules, so you can't use very advertising language. At the same time, it does have to sound nice. There are titles that sound very difficult, and other ones that sound quite attractive. So again, I hope that afterwards you can download this presentation, because we have lots of examples that come directly from manuscripts. So this is actually a paper that got published eventually, but only after the title and, of course, a few other things were changed. So there was too much information here in the title. It was too long. So the editors suggested the following title, and this is what got published eventually. So maybe afterwards, if you download the presentation, you can study what an editor considers important and what not. Now, your own name. You would think it's a little bit strange that I have a slide that just mentions spell your name right. That's basically what this slide says. But what we found when we started our own big database, Scopus, we tried to generate author reports. And what did we find? That actually many authors are inconsistent in how they spell their own name. So even things like between David, for a search engine, a search engine doesn't think, and so it identifies those as two different authors, even though they may be the same. And this is in Spanish, we have this problem that many people have double surnames. Sometimes they only use one, sometimes they use them both. Sometimes they use the hyphen, sometimes they don't. Now, you may ask, why is this important? People know. Well, the thing is, again, people find information electronically, And for a search engine, for an algorithm, these are two different names. Now, okay, I know that probably no one in this audience has a Spanish surname, but many of you have Chinese names. And especially in Taiwan, when I get a business card, I see two names. I see a Chinese name, and then I often see a Western first name, like Jenny or Michael or whatever. And so your foreign colleagues may know you under a slightly different name than your international name. Now it's important, it's actually not important what is your legal name or the name you were born with or whatever. It is important that you always use exactly the same name, including the same abbreviations, the same hyphens, the same order of words. Like in Chinese, sometimes you use your first name first, but then when you talk to Western people, maybe you put your first name first, so you change the order. It's very confusing for search engines and may have influence on how many people find your paper and cite your paper. So be consistent. Oh, same thing, by the way, with affiliation. We found, for instance, for MIT, I mean, everybody knows MIT. And yet we found in our own database, we found many, many different ways of saying MIT. Some people say Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Some people write MIT without dots. Some people write MIT M.I.T. And all of those things make a difference. Abstracts. There are different kinds of abstracts, depending on the journal, depending on the subject field. Again, look at the journal, what kind of abstracts they have. Indicative abstracts, it's not the most used. It's more used for review articles and conference reports. Review articles don't really have content on their own. They describe other content. So what do you write in the abstract? You describe what you are going to write about. But for most original papers, you will write an informative abstract. And what that means is that you effectively write a summary of the paper that can stand on its own. So you describe what you've researched, how you've done it, what the results are, and why this is important. So it is like a miniature version of your paper without all the explanations. Now, an informative abstract has to be able to stand completely on its own. So don't refer to things you're going to do later. Just say what you did. Again, the reason is that many people don't read your whole paper. They will actually only read the abstract. So it is important that it can stand completely on its own. You know, if you find things, chemical abstracts, it's a very important database that has been around for 100 years. It just gives abstracts. And for many people, that is enough to get a quick overview about a specific field. So that's why an abstract, make sure that you can read it completely independently. In medical journals, you find often abstracts that are a little bit longer and that have headings on their own. Same thing, they should be able to stand on their own, but they make it even more specific by giving headings in the abstract. So here are summarizing what makes a good abstract. It has to be precise and not too much value statements in there, as you're never going to say in the following great piece of research. It has to be able to stand on its own. Make sure that as many people, as many scientists as possible can understand it. So avoid jargon. Keep it brief. And don't cite references. Again, because you're not going to include references in the abstract itself, and people don't read the whole paper necessarily. So it's no place to mention what's going to happen later or who you're citing. Keywords. Keywords have been around for as long as scientific publishing is there. Again, in the age of electronic information finding, keywords are even more important. They should really lead people to your article, especially the people that you want to read your article. And here are some examples of good versus bad keywords for one specific journal in psychiatry. Now, originally, the authors suggested as a keyword psychiatric disorder. And this is in a journal about psychiatry. Now, try typing in psychiatric disorder in any search engine, you will get 1 million references. And the chances that this paper will actually be found are close to 0. At the same time, they use a couple of abbreviations, and maybe they thought everybody who reads this journal will know what NRG1 is. And maybe they're right, but then they forgot that the people who are going to find this keyword are not necessarily specialists who read this journal. So that is why the editor suggested of, instead of NRG1, actually spelling out into Neuregulin 1. So study this later, and you can see what the difference is between the wrong and the right set of keywords. Introduction. And the introduction is a very misunderstood part of research. It's actually a part that authors like to get over with. They like to skip it. And because what you do in an introduction is actually that you show to the reader and to the editor, and to the reviewers, that you actually know what you're talking about, that you're in command of your subject. And how can you show that? It is by showing what other people have done, that you are very well aware of the whole literature. Because the editor is thinking, when he or she is reading your paper, the first thing they want to know, is this really original research? Can I be sure that no other journal has done something similar? And if you mention a lot of sources from all over the world and a lot of different journals, and you show that, okay, Smits in California has researched that, and von Hammerstein in Germany has studied the following, and Yakamoto from University of Tokyo has done this. The editor gets the impression, okay, this guy really knows what he's talking about, he's read all the literature, and then you're in a good position to say, but I feel these authors have not yet looked into what I'm going to describe. So this is my hypothesis, and this is what I'm going to do. So it is really important that you pick the right authors, and from that it should be clear what you want to do, why this is important, and you're going to describe briefly what you are going to do in the rest of the paper, and to what results that you expect this to lead. Now, journals have different rules for introductions. You can look at what the journal is doing, you can look at the guide for authors, and depending on the audience of the journal, if it's like a very general journal, then they may want you to explain more, because not everybody in the journal will understand what you're talking about. If it's very specific, they're only going to want to read like the exact papers that lead to your own paper. They don't really want you to write everything. The introduction is also the place to define anything that is not known by everybody yet. So this could be substances, this could be abbreviations, that kind of thing. Now, what the editor doesn't want is that you're showing off. Maybe you've been doing your PhD research for a while, you've read hundreds and hundreds of articles, and you're very proud of that. And you want to show the editor, look at all the stuff I've read, I'm very smart. And that's not what you should do. You shouldn't write too much, because then all articles in the journal would have very, very similar introductions. They would all describe the field starting from its beginning. So that's not what it's for. Of course, don't cite yourself too much. And Actually, apart from being very proud of your own work, the other reason that people cite themselves more than they cite others is simply because you know your own research the best. So that is actually a positive reason for mentioning yourself. But again, the editor or the reviewer is not going to necessarily think that's very positive, that you write too much about yourself and not about others. And maybe the editor thinks like, hey, where's my paper? He should have mentioned my paper. Or maybe the reviewer thinks that. So. You're not going to describe methods yet, results, conclusions. You're just going to outline, because later you have a method section and results section. So no need in repeating yourself. Again, don't use words that don't have a scientific meaning. Novel for the first time, magnificent, extremely important, it's not scientific. Only use significant in a statistical sense. If you say your research is very significant, then what it means is that it has a very low probability of error, that you tested for the standard error, and so on. It doesn't have any other meaning in science. So again, we don't really have enough time to go into all these the details of these introductions, of these examples. But in the examples, what you will always see, that there are a couple of key phrases that lead the reader into your article, and they indicate what it's doing. So all these red words are functional indicators. They're not just words. They are actually, their usage is very rigid. So if you mention something like has been shown to, make sure that you know exactly what it means and what degree of probability that it has. Now, in Chinese, verbs are less complex than they are in English. In English, there are a lot of ways in a verb to express a certain degree of probability. You can have can, could, may, might. All of the things are slightly different nuances of probability. And make sure you get them right, because otherwise reviewers get uneasy. Like, is the person saying that something has happened for sure? Or is he saying there is a strong probability? So be careful in how you write this. You will typically find things in an introduction like previous studies have shown that, because you're always talking about other people's literature. However, I think almost every introduction will have the word however, because that is the part that you indicate like, they have done this, however, I'm going to do something else. And here you go to indicate your importance. Understanding this should provide. So you're saying the importance of your work, and then you go, in this report, and then you describe what you're going to do next. After the introduction, you can go into the methods. The methods shouldn't be too hard to write, because there is a simple rule. Just remember the first sentence. The method section must enable the reader to replicate what your experiment exactly. Now, in most cases, the reviewer is not going to go to his lab and do all of these things and see if you really got that result or if it can be replicated. But in principle, it should be possible. And that means that you're going to describe as much as possible which kinds of compounds you used. In many cases, you should also mention where you bought them. If you use machines, you should probably mention the brands and the generation. You should use, let's say you use a microwave oven. You should mention the brands. By the way, this brand should probably not be a commercial brand for the kitchen. Sometimes we get that we get a Philips microwave or something. It has to be like a reliable and precise instrument. So provide everything there so that people can replicate your experiment. once in a while, actually people do try to replicate. Some of you may know that about 10 years ago, there was an English group, and they claimed to have produced fusion at room temperature, cold fusion. So of course the whole world was excited. This was mentioned on CNN and every newspaper. British scientists produced cold fusion. And the paper was accepted, of course, without somebody else having done cold fusion, because that requires a lot of money and experiments. But it sounded very plausible. The authors were very specific in how they achieved the cold fusion. They mentioned everything that they did very specifically. So the paper got accepted. Later, because the results were so extremely significant, other people tried to do the same thing, and nobody has been able to produce the cold fusion since, so now the article is discredited. It is, however, one of the most cited articles ever. So maybe my advice is that if you write a wrong article, write something that is spectacularly wrong. You're going to get a lot of citations. Summary? No, we go to results section now. Results section can be very short because you simply explain, okay, this is what we found as a result of our setup. So a results section can be as small as just a table with the results and one sentence of explanation, or it can really be just a couple of graphs and that's it. And you don't have to do more. The results section is really there to show you exactly, okay, we did this, we got that. Numbers, facts. No real interpretation yet. Now, a question that I sometimes get is like, why are scientific articles so strict? It's a little bit boring, isn't it? Because you have your exciting results. Why not say something about significance or something else? The reason is that people don't read scientific articles for fun. They read it to get information out of them in the most efficient way. So this means that people, experienced readers, they will go to specific sections and look exactly in that section to find what they need. And if they don't find it there, maybe they will not even look at the other sections. And this definitely includes reviewers. Reviewers are people who look at lots of papers, so they will quickly check in each section, has the author mentioned this in the appropriate place? And on the basis of that, they will give a piece of advice to the editor. So that's why you have to put results in results and not anywhere else. And if you draw conclusions, there's a conclusion section for that. So don't get those sections mixed up. Now, graphics. Graphics are extremely powerful. They can show in just an image what you might need several paragraphs for to explain. So, graphs. My first boss, when I took my first job as a desk editor, he told me that the best papers, that the graphics can almost be like the heart of the whole paper. That the graphics show immediately what the paper is about and maybe even the significance. And the rest is just explanation and further detail, but it's really the graph that can convey the whole meaning. So the Journal of Organic Chemistry, one of the very famous chemistry journals, this is a quote of the editor. He also says, readers often look at the graphics first and many times go no further. So if you have a powerful graph, this is a really great way of getting the reviewer interested in your paper and express a positive opinion about it. Then, of course, a graph, it always needs a little explanation. What is in the graph? The caption should be able to stand alone. It should say exactly what the graph does. Now, the data, if you have a good graph, people can immediately say what you want to say. If it's a bad graph, they have no idea. So the graph has to be very clear. And only use color when you can't say things in a different way. Otherwise, it's just distracting. Not to mention, it can increase your costs because in printed journals, many journals actually, if you want to print a color figure, they charge a fee, and the fee can be pretty high, something like $1,500 or something. So if you can say it in a different way without color, then just do that. Of course, when you have a brain scan with very complex areas, color is by far the best way. But think about it. Now, this is a way of expressing something that is actually not recommended. The author probably thought, let's be complete. Let's just say everything I found. And he presented a very long table that the reader would probably have to stare at the screen. And if they're not very patient, they would probably just move on. And yeah, we don't think this table added anything. In this case, actually, just one sentence would have been more clear than printing the whole table. Also here, this is another example of where the table is actually more clear than the graphics. The graphics show the little bars, but there's a very big difference between the lowest amounts mentioned and the highest amounts. And in the table, there's not that many data, and you can see it very clearly what the results were. Whereas here, it's really too hard to see what the significance is, especially of the smaller parts. All this tells you is that this part was much more significant than this part, but it's not really helping the reader or the editor. Okay. An example of a graph that we think had potential, but that was not very well executed. I'm going to let you look at it a little bit, so maybe you can form your own opinion about what's wrong with it. And I'm going to get some water so I can keep talking to you. So this graph, you see different data points here, but here it starts to get cluttered. And you know that there's some trend going on, but the trends overlap a little bit. And so it's not really clear what is happening here. Also, regardless of whether you are in this field or not, you just see a couple of capital letters that are probably abbreviations, but what does it mean? What is really being researched here? So then we had a second, the first revision of this graph is actually already at least the legend is better now. But the picture itself, it's still cluttered and a little bit unclear. So what we argued then is, why don't you tear this apart and simply show this compound and then the calcined versus the uncalcined version, because that was what this really was about. Show the trend lines. You tear it apart so that you can show more clearly what's really going on. And so in the end, we decided to publish these two graphs instead of the one that was very unclear. Statistics. Again, one of the reasons that we started holding these presentations is because people often make avoidable mistakes. Statistics is definitely one of them. Most of the people here will have at least had the basics of statistics in your first year. And often it is treated by authors as an afterthought. Like, I know this machine works. I already had my experiment. I know it's interesting. Oh yeah, let's do the statistics. And there are often a lot of very basic mistakes made in statistics. And there are always readers who are statisticians, and they're very picky, and they always pick up on it. And it is important. No experiment can be complete without really indicating the important statistics of the experiment. So you always have to have a mean and a standard deviation. Never forget it. Are you dealing with a representative population? is there any skews going on? All of these things you have to mention, especially in clinical trials, but I would say in many other cases, percentages are not enough. You have to mention the actual numbers. I mean, if you go to certain epidemiological studies, they follow like 30,000 people for 20 years. Whatever they do is statistically going to be very, very significant. But there are also studies done with only like 15 subjects. And in that case, you have to mention this and be very careful about the conclusions that you draw. You have to give your p-value, the probability, and be very, very precise about it. Don't just round it off. And again, significance means statistical significance and only that. Moving on to discussion. So you described your results, you've had your graphs, your table, you presented all your numbers, and then you're going to relate those results to the hypothesis and the aims of the study you described in the beginning. You're also going to compare it to what other people have found. And you will give interpretations. Why are these results coming out in the way they did? You also mention the limitations of your study. And science is moving on completely all the time. And research that was found last year is found actually to be missing some significant parts. And everybody knows that. I mean, one day, your research will have moved on or will not be so significant anymore. And that's great. That's the great thing about science, that science always keeps reinventing itself. So it's quite okay to mention the things you haven't done yet or the things that should be done in the future. You don't have to hide it. It doesn't make you weaker. Another thing that doesn't make you weaker is to mention studies that are in contradiction with what you are saying. It is okay to disagree with previous authors. Actually, that's how science evolves, by authors always criticizing each other. But the last thing you should do is ignore the people that disagree with you or that you disagree with. Because the editor will probably know those articles. Editors read everything. And if you don't show those articles, they will think that you don't know these people that disagree with you. So it's much better to say, like, Mr. Francois from France, he found the following. However, we have reason to believe that actually this is not completely true, and we will show the following in our study. So it's okay to disagree, but just be open and explicit about it. Here's an example of a discussion section that got accepted. Again, you will have key pointers that lead the reader into what was done. So in this study, you mention, okay, this is my experiment. You see that the treatment cost significant, blah, blah, blah. You describe the results. Then you refer back to other authors. You see here, Shimizu, they thought that this was going to do the following. However, there you have it again. We found other people have shown this. And then you indicate what you think of it. Now, conclusion is a little bit of a tricky section because it doesn't always exist. Quite often, in some journals, the results, the discussion and the conclusion, they get merged. Discussion and conclusion, they get taken into one because you're already describing how does your results compare to your aims, to your aim of your study and to the hypothesis. So maybe the conclusion is simply my hypothesis is right and my limitations are the following. So the next studies should go into researching what my limitations are. However, in other journals, there is a specific conclusion part. So look at the journal again, like what they do exactly. By the way, the conclusion is not the same as the abstract. The abstract is the summary the miniature of your own paper, the conclusion is not that. You're not going to repeat what was already said in the methods, results, discussion section. It is actually a section on its own. Science can be very inspiring. It can make you dream. It can make you dream of a future that is far away from now. Unfortunately, a scientific paper is not the place to get really philosophical about bigger significances for the whole world. In that sense, science is a little bit boring. You only talk about exactly what you've researched and what that is going to lead to. You don't speculate about a better world. The place to do that would be, for instance, at a keynote lecture at a conference. There you can do those things. Or if you are the editor of a journal, you're allowed to dream once in a while in maybe the first issue of a new year. There you can do that. In a scientific paper, you don't get far away from the exact conclusions that you've drawn. So here's the conclusion. So it mentions here findings from our study. They agree with previous studies. And here it says things that are really scientific. There is a need to establish those dependent effects of these substances. So again, it's a conclusion, but it's quite specific. And it shows that actually current practices, intake at the upper level of the current UK guideline range may not influence cardiovascular risk factors in fairly healthy populations. So it actually gives a very concrete suggestion that maybe guidelines may need to be revised for certain populations. That is a very concrete conclusion of this finding supported by the results. It is actually one thing that is a major shortcoming for young authors. As a PhD student, you spend 4 years researching something very, very specific. You've spent 80% of your time in the lab. Maybe you've slept in the lab next to your experiment. So for you, your experiment is the most important thing in the world, and you see the significance, and for you it is important. But the editor sees lots of different studies, and maybe they see your article, they see, okay, this looks solid. It looks like a solid experiment. It looks like the author really masters his subject. It looks like the experiment is well set up. But what does it mean? So the conclusion is not an afterthought. It is actually describing really the significance. And that is, in the end, what the editor cares about. There are journals that don't care too much about significance. They just describe experiments without putting it into context. Those are not the most prestigious journals. It really has to have the good editors and the best journals. They really want to help progress science. So they want to know, why is this paper not just sound, but why is it important for the field? So make sure that you think about that. And one trick is to actually talk to people that are also scientists, but maybe do research that's a little bit different than you are doing. Ask them to read your paper. And if they can see from your paper why it is important, then actually you probably have done a good job at explaining the importance of your research. If they don't, you have to really think carefully or explain yourselves more clearly. Don't assume that a reviewer is immediately going to see, that's why it's important. Okay, acknowledgments. Slightly less important to get you accepted. It is a section where you thank everybody that has not written your paper. Of course, there are co-authors, but maybe you were setting up a pretty complex technical system, or you were dealing with a new piece of equipment and you don't really know how it works. So you asked a lab technician. And actually, the lab technician maybe came in on a Saturday or Sunday just to help you set it up. Now, if you don't acknowledge them, for the next experiment, they're probably not going to be so nice to you anymore. So this is the place where you can actually mention everybody who helped you, but it's not an author. It could also be maybe a friend you have in England who really took the trouble of reading your whole paper, maybe correcting some phrases, giving you advice. You can really use the acknowledgement to mention them. Also, sources of funding. It is essential and often a requirement that if somebody gives you $100,000 to do an experiment, or has given you a scholarship so that you could study for 4 years or study abroad, this is the place to thank them. So don't forget it, or it might be less easier to get a scholarship or a grant next time. It is also the place where you mention people that that sometimes you may think maybe this should be an author. So maybe you have too many authors. You mentioned 6 authors because 2 of them have helped you, or maybe they've looked at your English, but they're not really responsible for the content. So those people should not be authors, but they should be acknowledged. References. Again, a very boring section, but a section that is completely in your control. Different journals want different reference styles. Just do it. And I know that references, you've already mentioned the journal, you mentioned the year, you mentioned the page numbers. What more do they want? Can people not fix it afterwards? And actually the answer is typesetters can fix reference styles almost automatically. And they often do. So then the question is, why should you spend all this boring work getting the exact commas right and capitals, no capitals, abbreviations of journals or not, American Chemical Society style or Harvard style or APA style? There are lots of different styles. But the thing is, again, that the reviewers are very loyal to their journal, and they like to quickly check the information. And if they see a messy reference list, they get irritated. And you don't want an irritated reviewer. That's the whole point. You want a reviewer that really likes your paper. It looks good. The references are okay. So even though it's silly, just get it right. Fortunately, today there is reference software. And in some abstracting databases, you can simply click on the articles you want to cite, and then you can export the citation list in any format that you want. So maybe you submit it first to a journal of one publisher, they want a certain style. Maybe your article gets rejected, and you submit to a journal with a different style, and then the software can fix your reference style. So these things are available. Just use them, because it does help you. And one thing to avoid in references is anything that cannot really be checked by editors or reviewers. The whole point of a reference list is that it leads readers to the literature that you mentioned, so that they can check if you say that Yakamoto at University of Tokyo has proven the following. Maybe the reviewers think, oh, is that really proven? That's the first I've heard of it. So maybe they want to check that. So that's why personal communications, unpublished observations, or even conference proceedings that are hard to find, reviewers don't really like to see too much of that. I know it can be tempting. Maybe you were at a conference and you managed to speak to the Nobel Prize winner. These things happen. And he gave you a brilliant insight, and you want to mention it. You can mention like personal communication at conference. Just don't do too much of it, and make sure that you have more than enough international literature there in well-known journals. Again, a question I get often everywhere I go where people don't speak English: what about local language journals? On the one hand, I feel that there is a wealth of information also in local journals, in Spanish-speaking journals, French-speaking journals, Chinese-speaking journals, and it is a pity, it has some essential insights, and you want to refer to it, At the same time, the reviewer cannot check it because it's probably an American or someone from Australia or for someone from Japan or wherever. So on the one hand, I say I can't. I don't want to say don't do it because I think those journals have their value too. On the other hand, bear in mind the reality of that the reviewers want to see things that they are familiar with and that they can check. So don't do it too much. Here you see a couple of examples of how different references look like in different styles. Again, it gets a little bit silly and boring. Like, okay, here it says MJ without the dots, MJ with dots, without brackets, within brackets. Again, doesn't matter for the information. It doesn't change the content, but it helps the editor and the reviewers. Supplementary material. Increasingly, this is getting important, and it has an influence on how published articles look. Because in the past, everything had to be in the paper, and the paper couldn't be too long, so you can't mention everything, but you have to mention what is important for the readers. Now, today, what you see is that actually some journals are publishing shorter articles. They just publish exactly the findings and exactly the information that is necessary to support the hypothesis, but nothing else. And for the rest, they refer to supplementary material online. And this is actually great because on the one hand, the article shows you quickly what you need to know. And if you really think like, yeah, but I would like to I would like to study these data myself and do some other transformations with the table, and now you can. Because some journals, they accept that you simply submit all data and they just publish it online as a supplement, not to be printed, and then later people can manipulate all those data. Or you can submit movies of your experiments, or you can have sound fragments, which can sometimes be very relevant. So all of those things make articles richer today. Just make sure that you make a clear distinction what you want in the article and what you think should be published only as a supplement. Some technical details that I hope can get you closer to acceptance. Just about the length. Now, manuscripts are in general, for original articles, between 25 and 30 pages, leading to about 10 to 15 pages, maximum 20 of an original article. Don't make it too long, and especially be careful with length if you are submitting a letter article or a short communication. The whole point about letter journals is that they publish quick information on a limited amount of space. And these journals, they often have word limits, and if they say 3,000 words maximum, don't give them 3,001 words. And again, the editors are often quite famous people, and so they have people to help them. And they may very well ask their secretary, okay, just open the article in Word, go to the word count. If it's 3,001 words or more, I don't want to see it. And you get a standard rejection letter. And some journals are specific. Some journals will actually say to you, if you shorten it, we will reconsider it. Other journals are so swamped in articles. Some journals have rejection rates of 90%. And so whenever they find anything wrong with the manuscript, you get a standard rejection letter, maybe even without explanation. I know this is frustrating for you, so try everything you can just to make sure that those little details are right. By the way, you may think that the journals with these very high rejection rates, oh, but that must be Cell or Nature or Science. Of course, those have high rejection rates. But you'd be surprised at many normal journals that you just read, and they're good, but they're nothing very special. that they can have extremely high rejection rates. And any idea why this is, that a normal journal still has an extremely high rejection rate? The reason is the expectation of the author. Now, for instance, the Lancet or Cell, everybody knows that in that field. They have impact factors of over 30. And so before any author submits to the Lancet, what they're going to do is, first of all, they're going to take a long time to get their experiment exactly right. They're going to discuss with their dean, like, okay, is this really important enough for the Lancet? And maybe they even will talk to specialists at the funding agency. Do you think the Lancet will like this? So when they finally submit to the Lancet, it will probably be a pretty good manuscript. So actually what we found is that people who finally submit to the Lancet, actually the rejection rates are not that bad. You know, it's still 75% or something, but people expect it higher. Whereas Elsevier has a journal, Materials Research Bulletin, and on the one hand, most people in materials research know this journal. On the other hand, it doesn't have too high an impact factor. The editor is not extremely famous. And so what do we see? Every PhD student in the world thinks it's easy to get in. So the paper gets so, the journal gets so many papers that they have to reject more than 90%. And it's simply because the expectations of the author. So don't assume that just looking at the impact factor that you can think it's easy to get in or not easy to get in. There may be a lot of surprises there. A little bit about abbreviations. There are no strict rules for that. I mean, of course, you can say that no journal will expect you to spell out DNA. However, some journals might expect you to explain pretty obvious abbreviations. And of course, the ones that do that most are journals that are trying to reach a wider audience. Again, a journal like The Lancet is actually also read by policymakers, not necessarily doctors. So they want to make sure that, that it's really clear from the article what exactly is meant. So look a little bit in the journal, look in the guide for authors, what they say about the abbreviations. If you have a term that is only mentioned once or twice, don't bother to abbreviate it, just write it in full. Acronyms, it's actually convention really if you have to abbreviate it or not, or have to spell it out, or if you have to use capitals or not. Cover letter. Again, this is one of the reasons that I'm happy to be here today, because actually there's lots of material online that teaches you how to write an introduction or a results section. There's not too much question about that. It's just a question of getting to know it and studying it. Cover letter, however, doesn't get mentioned that much, and actually it is a powerful tool. It can be a very powerful tool to you. Whereas there are a lot of restrictions in the article itself, in the cover letter, there are often no strict conventions. In a cover letter, you can write to the editor from person to person. So in the cover letter, it is actually okay to say, dear editor, I love your journal. Maybe you don't have to be that obvious, but editors are people, they love their journals, and one thing that they really don't like is if people click submit on the electronic submission page without really knowing the journal very well. Some authors submit simply based on the title of the journal. And then the editor starts reading it, and he finds out that the author hasn't really checked the aims and scope, or that it's not really suitable, or that the article type is not really what the journal publishes, and they hate that. But in the cover letter, you can say, dear editor, I've been reading your journal during my whole PhD period. I've read, and what I've noticed is that many articles in your journal are close to my own research. And so I'm submitting to you the following article, and I believe it is important for the following reasons. So you can say it in your own words, and don't make it too long. You know, it has to be, the editor has to quickly feel, okay, this is the author, this is why this person has submitted, and this is why he thinks it's important. And he will think, yeah, this author has clearly thought about the submission. Then something else that people don't know is that actually, in the cover letter, you can suggest potential reviewers. So often I hear reviewers are not fair, they haven't read my article properly, or they don't know my subject properly. Well, here's your chance. Say to the editor, I think the following people would be good reviewers for my article. And there is a big chance that the editor will actually follow your suggestion. Maybe not all of them. Maybe he will give one to the reviewer you like and one to a reviewer that he already trusts. But actually, it's hard to find good reviewers for any editor because there are so many papers. And reviewers have to be qualified and have to be willing to do it. And actually, editors like it when they hear about reviewers that they don't know yet. Now, don't mention your own supervisor. Probably don't even mention somebody from your own country, because then the editor feels, no, he may be mentioning his friend. That's not proper. However, how do you find potential reviewers? Well, look at your own reference list. You have been reading a lot of articles before you even started to write your article, and you've used those in the references. Very likely, the people in the reference list will be people who know your subject very well, almost by definition. And you don't have to know them, and you don't even have to ask their permission. Actually, we prefer that you don't. But you might find that there is a really great group from Max Planck, and they're really going to understand what your research is about. Mention them. Maybe they use them. Also, another thing, you can mention reviewers that you don't want to review your article. It's okay. There's nothing wrong about that. Research is competitive. Researchers want to be the first to make a discovery. Maybe you don't even want the guys at the competing research lab to know about what you're doing because you're giving that information before it's even published, and that can give competitive information to somebody else. It's okay to say to the editor, I prefer that you don't send it to the following guys at UCLA because actually we consider them competitors. Quite often the editor will respect that. It's still their own choice. They will never say to you, okay, I followed your suggestions, but you can mention your preference and it will not reflect badly on you. These are some suggestions for a cover letter. Be specific, address it to the editors. Really say, dear editor Smith, if you say, dear editor, there's already a little suspicion that you might have submitted this article to a couple of journals with the same letter. One thing not to do is mention a different editor's name of a competing journal. Believe me, we do get those letters. You know, we're Elsevier, and we receive a letter, Dear Wiley, please accept my manuscript. And then, you know, the editor immediately knows, he wanted to go to the competing journal first, and he couldn't get in, and that's why he comes to me. So immediately you get like a negative feeling towards your manuscript. So if you do it right. You mention your article, you mention your research and other things you've done maybe. Main findings, significance. It doesn't hurt today to mention that your research is original and has never been published because there have been too many problems with research being submitted many times or published in different journals. Conflict of interest, especially in pharmaceutical companies, or also if you're working together with companies or in material science that might make your research commercial, confirm that you don't have financial interest, or at least mention if you do. It's good to be open. Another favorite section of mine is the response to reviewers. the vast majority of articles does not get accepted right away. Actually, almost all articles get sent back with a request for minor or major revision. It's perfectly normal, so I want to tell you how to deal with that. First of all, read the reviewer's comments. This is actually consider even if you don't agree with it, read it and try to understand why they're saying this. Even if they're wrong, maybe you haven't been clear enough. So read it and consider it as a gift, as a learning experience. Then respond to all points. Never ever ignore a comment by a reviewer. I know that this can be sometimes, authors feel it's impolite to disagree with the reviewer. It's okay, it's not impolite. What is a problem is if you ignore the reviewer's comments. It makes the editors nervous. Even if it is a bad comment from a reviewer, you still have to mention it. Otherwise, the editor thinks you're ignoring it, and it will more easily lead to rejection. Be specific. Make sure it is very clear that if the reviewer gives a comment, that you are very clear in your reaction. Mention the page and the line numbers so that people can find it quickly. If they ask you to do additional calculations, just do it, except if you really think that it is unnecessary, and then you have to explain why. So here's an example of a bad and a good response for a reviewer. So probably the reviewer has said, yeah, but I don't think this and this is proven. So at first, the author said, well, the reviewer is clearly ignorant. He doesn't know the literature himself. What a bad reviewer. Now, this is going to go back to the reviewer, and if they see a sentence like this, you're going to get very uneasy feelings. Whereas it is actually very easy to say the following: thank you for your comment. However, we feel that actually the thing you're missing has been supported by the following work, who actually proved the following. And then you actually have disagreed with the reviewer, but in a very mature and respectable way. And it's very likely that the editor will say, actually, that's a good point. You don't have to change it. So be very specific about what you're changing. So, many times it's just little comments, and you think, actually, that's right. I will quickly correct it. But mention that you've corrected it. Otherwise, the editor has to read the whole manuscript again. They don't like that. They don't have time. Also, something quickly. Sometimes criticism keeps coming back, but you have one response to it. Simply refer to it. See section 1 for response. Otherwise, it gets a bit boring. Also, an example of the reviewer's comments. See the author. You can immediately see what the author says. It's in italic. He identified it by saying author's reply, and basically quickly commenting, actually, yeah, you have a point. We agree. We will add an appropriate, and so on. Rejection happens for a majority of papers. For Elsevier, the figure is about 60%. This is quite common for the industry. For some publishers, it's lower. The answer is really, the reason why this happens is there are so many submissions. As was mentioned before, universities encourage their authors to publish. Sometimes it's even a requirement. In a few countries, if researchers don't keep publishing, their position is in danger, or they can't make a promotion to senior lecturer. So the pressure is high, and as a result, publishers receive loads and loads of papers. At the same time, we hear from the same universities that buy journals, don't give us more papers every year. We want very good papers that are used and cited, but we don't place a value just on more quantity. So as Elsevier and also our competitors, we have a reason to improve the quality, but not the quantity. So this is a challenge for authors. I realize that. So if you get rejected, at least you're not the only one. It's actually you're part of a majority. And the key then is not to take it personally, but try to learn from the experiments. If the reviewer gives a lot of comments, learn from them. Learn what reviewers want. Learn what the editors want. Now, I know that not all journals are very good at this. I know that many of you have probably received a letter that says, "Dear author, thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, we cannot accept it." That's not really helpful, is it? And we encourage our editors to actually give a real explanation what's wrong with it. And unfortunately, sometimes nothing is wrong with it. It's just that the editor can only accept a limited amount of articles, and maybe they have already published something a little bit similar earlier in the year, and then they say on the basis of that, even though it's a good paper, even though it is a little bit significant, I'm not going to publish it now. So if you are fortunate enough to receive a lot of reviewers' comments, then really learn from them. We have some editors that do way more than they have to do. We ask our editors to make fair judgments, but we have editors that actually rewrite abstracts for authors, even the ones that get rejected. Now, if you are so fortunate to have an editor that rejects you but helps you rewrite your abstract, learn from that. We have actually seen papers, and they get rejected in one journal, but with good criticism, and then the author submits it again the next day at a different journal, completely unchanged, not even using the editors or the reviewers' comments. Now, then you're really throwing away free advice, because with those comments, your article might have been a lot better. This is a suggestion I've received from an editor. This editor said to me that actually he doesn't mind. He actually prefers it if authors come to him and say, "This article has been rejected for the following journal. However, we've improved it a lot. We've listened to all the reviewers' comments. You can even include those previous reviews, and then submit it again." He says, I'm not prejudiced against those papers. Now, this is your own choice. Maybe you feel it reflects negatively on you that you have been rejected. Again, you're not alone. It's your own decision, but at least this editor said it's not a bad thing to mention it and even include the reviewers' reports, because it saves work for me and it may still lead to publication. I'm going to do a little bit about ethics, and some things are very obvious, some things are less obvious, but the consequences of not following ethics in publishing can be extremely dangerous for your career. So this is what one of our editors of our biggest journal says. It can earn rejection, not just rejection, but even a ban from publishing in the journal ever again. And bear in mind that when you are a scientist, you're part of a community. And you'd be surprised at how small global communities of scientists really are. If you are in the field of chromatography, there are probably around 100 scientists in the world that really decide and push the field forward. And they all know each other. And if you do something that makes an editor angry and is against ethical rules, you're not just in trouble with that journal. You may be in trouble with other journals as well. So here are the different things that you should be careful of. Let's go multiple submission I mentioned first. It's relatively innocent because at least what you're doing is you're spreading your risk of getting accepted. You hope to increase your chances. But reviewers hate it, and reviewers often review for more than one journal. Again, the community is not very big, and it happens quite a lot that a reviewer gets asked by one journal, "Please, would you review this paper?" The next day, he gets it from a competing journal, "Please, would you review this paper?" And he sees it's exactly the same. The consequence then is that it gets rejected for both journals. And this happens a lot, more often than you would think. Redundant publication. If you've already published something, don't publish it again. That's simply what it is. It also means if you have one experiment and it's often possible to do the experiment again at a slightly higher temperature. Or you change a few little things and then you write a paper again. And actually the paper is almost exactly the same, but you change a few details and you submit it again to a different journal. Editors really hate this. And again, they often find out because, again, through search engines, it is quite easy to see what else has been published already in a field. Editors don't do this because they distrust authors. They often do it to find reviewers. So they receive a paper with one subject, and then they search a little bit who else has written on the subject, and then they find that you have written a very similar paper only 6 months ago. Again, reason for rejection, and it has a bad effect on your reputation. You know, there might be some exceptions. You might have been at a conference and your article was published in conference proceedings. Conference proceedings often are not very well read. They are published one time, the people at the conference, they get the proceedings, but beyond that they don't have much influence. If your research is really important enough, you might think it should really appear in a proper journal. It can be okay, but mention it to the editor. Don't submit it without saying. So be very careful. Different language. Now, you may have published your paper in a Taiwanese journal, and now you think, actually, it's more significant than I thought. It should also appear in English, in a translation. Editors can be open to that argument. It's not a bad reason, I think, but you have to be open about it. Of course, you know, if you only publish it in Chinese, it puts big limits to who can read your article, and editors may be able to understand this, but you have to get approval from them first. Plagiarism. Okay, now it gets increasingly worse. Plagiarism is not the worst yet, but it's very serious. So here's one definition. Unfortunately, it's pretty broad. It's even about taking ideas. It's taking processes, it's results, or even words. And the key thing here is that you do it without giving the right credit. That is really what makes plagiarism plagiarism. So this is a definition from the American Office of Science and Technology Policy. It's taken very, very seriously. Here's another definition from a professor. And you can see that really people consider it as theft. So they think you're a thief if you've committed plagiarism in any way. The thing is that it's not just going to lead to rejection. It might lead to an inquiry. Your own research office at your own university might get contacted about it. They will get asked to do an official investigation. Your supervisor will ask to get involved, and why didn't he know about this? So it gets a complete mess if this gets ever found out. And of course, you all know if you copy a paper and you put your name on it, okay, that is the most blatant form of plagiarism and the most stupid one because it's easiest to find out. However, since plagiarism has a pretty broad definition, there are much smaller forms of plagiarism that also count as such. For instance, paraphrasing. You know, obviously, this is an example of improper paraphrasing. So this is the original, and actually the author does mention the previous author. So there is credit here, but the wording is exactly the same. This is considered a minor form of plagiarism. And we have to explain this in countries where people don't speak English as a main language, because often they do it because they're afraid that they will make mistakes in English. But what the editor sees is that they get nervous. Does the author really understand the original meaning? Because they just copied it. So you still have to say it in your own words, even if you mention it. Another thing, the introduction section. You're going to talk about a lot of literature, and you think, You know, this has all been done before. I'm mentioning these people. So they copy an introduction or part of an introduction from a different paper. And they think it's not that bad because my research is original and my conclusions are original. I just took the references and the introduction from this other paper. It is considered plagiarism, and you can get in big trouble. Again, the reason that it's not allowed is because the editor wants to make sure that you've read all those papers you refer to and that you understand them and explain them in your own words. Otherwise, you might just copy it without knowing what all of those papers really mean. So this is a bad paraphrase. Here is one that that is correct. So study this later in the downloads. You actually see that the author understands what the first author did and credits it properly. Okay, even more serious than plagiarism, data fabrication, where you invent the data. They're not real data. And this happens on all levels. On the one hand, we've seen it with students that are afraid that their experiment is not going to be ready in time, but they have to have their paper, and they just invent some data. On the other hand, it happens to very serious people, and there has been more than one case. The most famous one being in Korea recently, where there was done research on cloning, and actually that Korean researcher had a very good reputation. And actually his older research is very good, and it is true, because everybody has, of course, studied it now. It is just that when he came to the human cloning, that he wanted to achieve these results so badly, but he didn't get them. So he thought, let's just invent those results. And he could do that because he knew his subject so well that when he started lying, it actually looked realistic to reviewers. And of course, he was the only one doing that research, so nobody could say immediately, hey, wait a minute, I've tried to do that and it doesn't work. So, so even famous people sometimes feel that they can do this. And that's why we say that actually the most dangerous of all falsehoods is a slightly distorted truth. Because if you completely lie, if you invent everything, then people will notice immediately. But if you almost get the results, and then you invent a little bit, it's very difficult for reviewers to detect, at least immediately. But afterwards, if people start having doubts, and over time, usually people find out. Unethical research, mostly for pharmacology people, clinical research. Again, abide by the ethical rules of the journal that you're publishing in. If it's the British Medical Journal that you want to publishing in, then follow their rules on ethical research. Maybe the laws in your country are different. I know that. Different countries have different laws. But the British Medical Journal is bound by its own ethical rules, and they're not allowed to publish anything that is unethical by their own standards. So be aware of that. Authorship, make sure that you only make people authors that are really responsible for the whole content. Don't include people that are your friends. Don't include your supervisor just to honor the supervisor. And it's not just that we don't think these people should get credit, but if something is wrong with your paper, then everybody who gets mentioned as an author gets the blame. And quite often, you know, when there are too many authors on a paper, and the paper is great, and it gets citations, people will say like, hey, that's my paper. Look, I'm applying for a job. Look at the beautiful paper I've written. And when something goes wrong with the paper, they say, yeah, but it's the other guy. He was actually writing that part. So you don't get away with that. And actually, if you mention people like your professor, and the professor hasn't seen the paper, and you get in trouble, the professor gets blamed. And it's not a blame. You know, maybe the journal editor will understand, but the article will get retracted. The publisher will mention the reason of the retraction, and the name of all of those authors is there forever. It never gets away. So be very, very, very careful. So we're getting to our conclusion, and this is actually from one of our editors. And on a cheery note, he says, and I agree, that if you follow all of these things, that you have a much better chance to get accepted. I'm going to highlight some of them. You know, attention to details and checking your work. Simple things, get them right, and you make your reviewers happy. English, it's not your own language. Find all the help that you can get. Make sure that your paper looks good. Even if you think my content is good, also make sure that it looks good, because otherwise people cannot get to the content. Be original. The research has to be new, original. You have to be critical about your own research. And actually, I'm going to end with the one in the middle. Take your time. You know, you're under a lot of pressure. You want to graduate. You want to be in time for a grant application. And today, with electronic submissions, you can just upload the article, click submit. And you think, okay, if I do it faster, I will have a higher chance. But in the end, you're not saving time because you are increasing your chances of getting rejected by not taking enough time. So you've worked for months on your paper, and finally you feel it's ready. You've been staring at the paper for so long, but now you think it's ready. What you should not do is click submit. What you should do is go visit your friends, sing karaoke, go and have a beer with your friends. Don't look at the paper for a couple of days at all. And then you look at your paper again. And you'll be amazed, you're going to find a lot of little things that you can improve without any effort. And you didn't see them 3 days ago because you've been staring at the paper too much. But if you take that time and you use advice and you use your own critical eyes again, and then you submit, you make sure you get everything right, I would say you increase your chance of getting accepted by a vast percentage. So thank you very much, and good luck writing your papers.